Here we want to find the derivative of 1 over a times secant inverse of x over a, where a is a constant. Recall that the derivative of secant inverse of x is 1 over x times the square root of x squared minus 1. So the derivative of 1 over a times secant inverse of x over a, 1 over a is a constant, so we can move it and place it in front of the derivative here. And then x over a is the same as 1 over a times x. And so we want the derivative of secant inverse of 1 over a times x instead of secant inverse of x. And therefore the derivative of secant inverse of 1 over a times x, then in the place of x, we would have 1 over a times x. And in the place of x, we have 1 over a times x. And the chain rule says we have to multiply by the derivative of 1 over a times x. So once again, to get the derivative of secant inverse of 1 over a times x, then in the place of x, we just have to put 1 over a times x and 1 over a times x, and then multiply by the derivative of 1 over a times x. The derivative of 1 over a times x is just 1 over a. One over a times x squared is 1 over a squared times x squared. And now let's factor out the 1 over a squared. So put 1 over a squared in front of the parentheses and divide each term by 1 over a squared. So divide this by 1 over a squared and divide this by 1 over a squared. And then we get x squared minus a squared. And then we can check that 1 over a squared times x squared is 1 over a squared times x squared. 1 over a squared times a squared is just 1. The square root of 1 over a squared is 1 over a. 1 over a dividing by 1 over a is 1, so we get 1x. 1 over a dividing by 1 over a is also 1. So what's left is 1 over x times the square root of x squared minus a squared. And so in summary, the derivative of 1 over a times secant inverse of x over a is 1 over x times the square root of x squared minus a squared. And if we then therefore the antiderivative of 1 over x times the square root of x squared minus a squared will be 1 over a times secant inverse of x over a.